The hum of the command center just died. In the suffocating heat of a desert outpost, the lifeline to a dying convoy has been severed. While officers scream into dead handsets and panic ripples through the ranks, one woman, the cable clerk everyone mocked, reaches for a battered screwdriver. But as the static clears, she isn't just fixing a radio. She's translating enemy movements in real time. Who is this invisible soldier? And how does she know the sounds of a massacre before it happens? The air inside the Tactical Operations Center at Outpost Vanguard didn't just feel hot. It felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against the lungs of everyone inside. It was a thick cocktail of ozone, stale coffee, and the fine metallic dust that managed to penetrate even the most reinforced seals. Overhead, the rhythmic, lazy thrum of the ventilation fans did nothing to cool the room. They simply redistributed the stagnant heat, a constant reminder of the isolation outside the wire. In the far corner, tucked away from the glowing maps and the frantic energy of the command staff, sat Specialist Elena Vance. To the infantry squads passing through for their pre-patrol briefings, she was nothing more than Sparky, the cable girl. They saw a woman hunched over a workbench, her dark hair falling forward as a curtain to hide her eyes, her hands moving with a mechanical, repetitive rhythm as she tightened a screw into a battered field radio. Think about the silence of a person who is constantly surrounded by noise. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who is listening to things no one else can hear. "Look at her," a sergeant muttered to his squad, his voice loud enough to carry over the hum of the servers. He offered a jagged smirk as they headed toward the armory. "She can patch a frequency, but she couldn't patch a hole in a bucket." "Useful until the real work starts." A ripple of low laughter followed his comment, punctuated by the sharp clatter of gear and the metallic click of magazines being seated. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her focus remained entirely on the radio in front of her. Her fingers, calloused and steady, didn't tremble. If you looked closely at her wrist, you'd see a thin, pale scar, a jagged line that spoke of a different life. But no one at Vanguard ever looked closely enough to notice. They only saw the clerk sitting behind a wall of wires. In an environment where respect is measured by the caliber of your weapon or the number of doors you've kicked down, how does someone like Elena survive? She survives by becoming a ghost in the machine. She reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out a small, worn screwdriver. The handle was smooth, the plastic yellowed by decades of use. It wasn't army-issued. It was a relic from her father, a man who had survived the steaming jungles of a different era by learning one hard truth. The right tool in the right hands is the difference between a lifeline and a death sentence. To Elena, that screwdriver was more than a tool. It was an anchor. It reminded her that while the men in this room valued volume and bravado, the world was actually held together by the quiet ones who knew how to bridge the gaps when everything fell apart. The atmosphere in the room shifted suddenly. The casual banter died as a major stepped toward the central map, his boots heavy on the plywood floor. The tension didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a flicker. The monitors along the northern wall stuttered. The steady, reassuring green glow of the satellite links wavered, turning a sickly, translucent amber. Elena's head snapped up. For the first time, her eyes weren't on the radio, but on the flickering screens. She felt it before she heard it. A subtle change in the pitch of the electronics, a low-frequency hum that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Sir, we're losing the primary uplink," a technician called out, his voice thin and tight. His breathing had become shallow, his chest heaving as he frantically punched commands into a keyboard that refused to respond. "Reset the array, now!" the major barked, his hand slamming onto the metal edge of the console. The room erupted into a controlled panic. Officers leaned over shoulders, shouting orders that were swallowed by the rising static. Radios began to hiss, Not the usual white noise of an empty channel, but a jagged, aggressive interference that sounded like tearing metal. What would you do if the only thing connecting you to safety suddenly turned into a wall of screaming static? Elena stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't join the frantic rush toward the main servers. Instead, she moved toward the primary junction box at the back of the room, her movements fluid and deliberate. She could see the white knuckles of the lieutenant trying to force a headset to work, the smell of acrid, cold sweat beginning to fill the cramped space. Then, the world inside Outpost Vanguard went dark. The hum of the fans stopped. The glow of the maps vanished. For 3 heart-pounding seconds, the only sound was the collective intake of breath from 30 terrified soldiers. Then, the emergency lights kicked in, a haunting industrial red that cast long, skeletal shadows against the canvas walls. But the electronics didn't come back. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the sound of a total comms blackout. The lifeline was gone, and as Elena gripped her father's screwdriver in the crimson dark, she realized this wasn't a mechanical failure. The entire network hadn't just crashed. It had been severed. The crimson glow of the emergency lights at Outpost Vanguard didn't illuminate the room so much as it bruised it. In the sudden, heavy silence following the blackout, the only sound was the frantic, uneven clicking of keys as technicians tried to wake dead consoles. The air felt charged, thick with the scent of ionizing dust and the sharp, acidic tang of adrenaline-soaked sweat. Think about the psychological weight of total isolation. In the modern age of warfare, silence isn't peaceful. It is a predator. When the digital heartbeat of a base stops, you aren't just in the dark. You are blind, deaf, and waiting for the first strike. At the center of the command tent, a sergeant, the same one who had mocked Elena hours earlier, was no longer smirking. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving beneath his tactical vest as he gripped his rifle with white-knuckled intensity. He looked at the dead monitors as if he could force them back to life with sheer aggression. But the machines remained cold. The cable girl sat just a few feet away, her silhouette a sharp shadow against the red light. While the men around her spiraled into a frantic, uncoordinated panic, Elena Vance remained eerily still. Her hands were buried in her cargo pocket, her thumb tracing the smooth, familiar plastic of her father's screwdriver. "Vance, get the hell up here!" the major barked, his voice cracking with a strain he couldn't hide. He didn't look at her as a person. He looked at her as a desperate last resort. "Why are the primary arrays down? Is it the storm? An EMP?" Elena didn't rush. She stood with a deliberate, haunting composure that seemed to unsettle the officers more than the blackout itself. What would you do in a moment like this? Would you scream back at the people who had treated you like trash? Or would you let your competence be your only reply? "It's not the weather, sir," Elena said. Her voice was low, cutting through the frantic chatter of the TOC like a razor. It lacked the tremor of fear that was vibrating through every other soul in the room. She moved toward the main junction, her boots making a soft, gritty sound against the floorboards. "The spikes I saw before the blackout were surgical. This wasn't a crash. It was a targeted internal bypass." The room went still. The implication hung in the air like a lethal gas. If it was internal, they weren't just facing an enemy in the hills. They were facing a failure within their own walls. The major's face went pale, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path through the dust on his forehead. He opened his mouth to retort, to perhaps bark another insult, but the words died in his throat as a low, mournful sound echoed from the distance outside. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't artillery. It was the rhythm of a heavy machine gun miles away, distorted by the canyons. The broken arrow distress call they had glimpsed before the screens died was real. Somewhere out in the black expanse of the Dust Bowl canyons, a convoy was being torn apart, and Outpost Vanguard was sitting in a red-lit tomb, unable to even hear their screams. The sergeant stepped toward Elena, his shadow looming over her. "Then fix it, Sparky. Stop talking and twist some damn wires." He reached out as if to shove her toward the console, but he stopped. He stopped because Elena finally looked at him. Her eyes weren't filled with the hurt of a bullied clerk. They were flat, cold, and professional. The eyes of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had already processed it. "I am fixing it," she whispered. She knelt by the primary server rack, ignoring the frantic commands and the rising volume of the distant gunfire. She was back in the shadows where they had kept her. But now, the shadows were the only place where the work could get done. She felt the vibration of the base's secondary generators struggling to turn over, a mechanical groan that felt like a dying animal. The moral dilemma began to itch at the back of the room's collective mind. They had spent months making sure this woman felt like she didn't belong, and now their lives depended entirely on her willingness to save them. Elena pulled a hidden panel from the base of the rack. Her fingers moved with a terrifying precision, stripping insulation and bridging connections. She wasn't just working on a radio anymore. She was performing surgery on a lifeline. The smell of burning copper wafted up as she bypassed the fried logic boards. Suddenly, a handheld radio on the Major's belt chirped. It wasn't a clear voice. It was a chaotic mess of screaming wind and the staccato rhythm of outgoing fire. "Vanguard, do you copy? Ambushed. Northridge. We are taking heavy casualties." The voice was young, frantic, and bubbling with the wet sound of someone struggling to breathe. The Major grabbed the radio, his thumb hovering over the talk button, his face twisted in a mask of helplessness. "Convoy 6, this is Vanguard. We have a total talk failure. We can't—" The radio cut to a high-pitched, agonizing squeal of electronic interference. The signal was being jammed. Elena didn't look up from her wires, but her lips moved. She wasn't praying. She was counting. She was timing the intervals of the jamming signal, her mind working through a puzzle she had solved 1,000 times in a previous life they knew nothing about. She reached for her father's screwdriver, inserting it into a secondary port on the field console. "They're not just jamming us," Elena muttered, her voice barely audible over the static. Her hand tightened on the tool until her knuckles turned white. "What?" the Major yelled, leaning over her. "What are you talking about, Vance?" Elena's eyes snapped to a small, auxiliary frequency scout that had suddenly flickered to life under her touch. The needle was dancing frantically. She didn't look at the Major. She looked at the static, her head tilting as if she were listening to a symphony. "They're not just blocking the signal, sir," she said, her voice turning ice cold. "They're using our own repeater to talk to each other. I'm not just getting the convoy." She turned a dial, the screeching static falling away to reveal a guttural, rhythmic chanting in a language the officers didn't recognize, but Elena knew by heart. Her eyes went wide as she translated the words in her head, a series of coordinates and a command that made the blood in her veins turn to lead. "Sir," Elena said, her voice now a sharp command that stopped every heart in the room. "The convoy isn't the target, they're bait." She pointed to the flickering needle on the scout. "The enemy isn't moving toward the trucks. They're moving toward the ridge directly above us. They've been listening to us the whole time, and they're less than 500 meters from the gate." Before the Major could respond, the first mortar whistled through the air, the sound growing from a whisper to a scream that promised only one thing. The blackout was just the beginning of the end. The question is no longer if they can fix the radio. The question is, who is Elena Vance, and why is she the only one who knows exactly where the next shell is going to land? The scream of the incoming mortar shell was a sound that didn't just hit the ears. It vibrated through the marrow of every soldier standing inside the command tent. It was a high-pitched metallic whistle that seemed to stretch time into an agonizing, thin wire. Then came the impact, a dull, earth-shaking thud that sent a rain of dust and grit from the canvas ceiling, coating the red-lit consoles in a layer of desert grime. Think about the sheer, paralyzing confusion of a command center that has lost its eyes and ears. Imagine being the officer in charge, hearing your men dying in the distance while your own instruments hiss with the laughter of an enemy you can't see. What is a leader without a voice? The major stumbled, his hand slapping against a dead computer screen to keep his balance. His breathing was a series of ragged, wet gasps, and the smell of ozone from the fried electronics mixed with the primitive scent of fear. He looked at Elena Vance, who was still kneeling by the server rack. She hadn't flinched when the shell landed. Her hands remained buried in the guts of the machine, her fingers moving with a cold, terrifying precision as she bypassed the primary logic gates. "Vance, tell me you have a signal," the major roared, his voice cracking. He wasn't barking orders anymore. He was pleading. "I have something better," Elena replied. Her voice was a low, steady anchor in the storm of panic. She didn't look up, but her thumb pressed a final connection into place. Suddenly, the auxiliary scout speaker didn't just hiss, it spoke. A stream of guttural, rhythmic Pashto filled the cramped space. It was the sound of the enemy, clear and dangerously close. Elena's head tilted, her brow furrowing as she processed the cadence. To the officers in the room, it was just terrifying noise. To Elena, it was a roadmap to a massacre. "They're moving east along the ridge," she muttered, her eyes tracking an invisible line across the dark monitors. "They aren't trying to destroy the convoy. They're driving them into the bottleneck at the canyon floor. They're setting up a kill zone." How do you reconcile the cable girl you mocked with the woman now translating the blueprints of your destruction? The silence in the room was no longer dismissive. It was the silence of men realizing they had been blind to a predator in their own camp. The sergeant who had spent months calling her Sparky stood frozen, his rifle slung awkwardly over his shoulder, his palms slick with a cold sweat that made the weapon feel like a foreign object. He watched her hands, the way the small, yellow-handled screwdriver turned with surgical intent. He saw the scar on her wrist catch the flickering red light, a pale reminder that she had bled in places he had only read about in manuals. "If they hit that bottleneck, it's over," the major whispered, his eyes fixed on the paper map on the table. "We have no way to warn them. The jamming is too thick." Elena didn't answer with words. She reached for a secondary handset, one usually reserved for internal base tests. She began to flick switches most of the technicians didn't even know were active. She wasn't just fixing a radio anymore. She was rerouting the entire power grid of the TOC into a single, concentrated burst. The smell of scorched plastic began to fill the air as she pushed the equipment beyond its safety limits. Think about the pressure of a single second. If you fail, a dozen men die in the dark. If you succeed, you become a target. "I can punch through," Elena said, her voice dropping to a gravelly, authoritative tone that bypassed rank entirely. "But I need the secondary repeater on the north watchtower to hold. If that goes, we lose the window." Another mortar struck, closer this time. The ground buckled, and a heavy storage crate toppled over, narrowly missing a lieutenant who was huddled on the floor, his hands over his ears. The red emergency lights flickered and died, leaving the room in a soul-crushing blackness, save for the single, ghostly green glow of Elena's auxiliary screen. "I'm in," she whispered. She keyed the handset. The room held its breath. The only sound was the high-pitched whine of the overcharged transmitter and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the machine guns on the ridge. "Convoy 6, this is Vanguard Alpha," Elena said into the mic. She didn't sound like a clerk. She sounded like a goddess of war. "Do not enter the bottleneck. Break contact, heading 270. The ridge is a kill zone. Acknowledge." For a heartbeat, There was only static. Then, a voice broke through, distorted, frantic, but alive. "Vanguard! Is that you? We're pinned. We can't see the ridge." "Trust the voice," Elena commanded, her grip tightening on the handset until her knuckles turned white. "Move now, or you're dead in 5 minutes." As the convoy commander began to bark orders over the air, Elena leaned back, her face illuminated by the sickly green light of the console. She had done the impossible. She had reached through the blackout and pulled them back from the edge. But as she reached for her father's screwdriver to stabilize the dying connection, her sleeve pulled back further than usual. The sergeant, standing closest to her, looked down. His breath hitched in his throat. In the dim green light, he saw it clearly for the first time. The faded ink of a tattoo on her forearm. It wasn't a local design or a base quirk. It was a pair of wings split by lightning bolts, the unmistakable mark of a Tier 1 combat controller. His eyes snapped to hers, wide with a sudden, bone-chilling realization. She wasn't just a signal specialist. She was the Viper from the legends of Operation Iron Veil. But before he could utter a single word, the tent flap was ripped open. A man stepped out of the desert night, covered in the gray ash of the canyon floor, a Navy SEAL trident pinned to his chest. He ignored the major. He ignored the sergeant. His eyes locked onto Elena Vance. "By God," the commander rasped, his voice heavy with the weight of 1,000 ghosts. "Whitaker? Is that really you?" The room went cold. "Whitaker!" The major looked from the SEAL to Elena. That wasn't the name on her file. That wasn't the woman they thought they knew. The SEAL commander stepped into the green light, his gaze dropping to her forearm, then back to her steady, unblinking eyes. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a greeting. He did something that made every jaw in the room drop. He snapped his spine rigid, his boots clicking on the gritty floor, and he raised his hand in a slow, sharp, and reverent salute. The man who just walked out of a massacre is saluting the cable girl. Why? Because Elena Vance isn't just fixing the radio. She's the reason he's still breathing. Don't click away. The truth about Operation Iron Veil is about to change everything. The salute from the Navy SEAL commander hung in the red-tinted air of the command tent like a frozen lightning bolt. It was a gesture so jarring, so completely at odds with the hierarchy of Outpost Vanguard, that the frantic noise of the room seemed to vanish. The major's mouth hung slightly open, his hand still hovering over a dead radio, while the sergeant who had spent weeks mocking Sparky felt a cold, hollow sensation open up in the pit of his stomach. Think about the moment the mask falls off. Imagine the person you've treated as a footnote suddenly being revealed as the protagonist of a story you aren't even qualified to read. How do you look them in the eye? "Commander," Elena said. Her voice didn't waver. She didn't stand to return the salute. She remained knelt by the gutted server rack, her father's screwdriver still gripped in her hand like a scepter of iron. She wasn't Specialist Vance anymore. The name on her fatigues was a lie, a thin veil of comfort she had wrapped around herself to escape the noise of her past. "We thought you were gone after Iron Veil," the commander rasped. He ignored the confusion of the officers around him. His eyes were fixed on the tattoo on her forearm, the wings and the lightning. "The boys in the teams. We still talk about the voice on the radio that brought the fire when the sky was falling. We didn't know you'd transferred to a signal unit. We didn't know you were here." The major stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and a desperate need for control. "Commander, what is this? Specialist Vance is a cable clerk. She's support staff." The SEAL turned his head slowly. The look he gave the major was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look a survivor gives to someone who has never felt the heat of a barrel against their cheek. "Support staff?" the commander whispered, his voice vibrating with suppressed fury. "This woman is a Tier 1 Joint Terminal Attack Controller. She's not just support. She's the reason 3 platoons of my men didn't come home in boxes 5 years ago. She held a ridge alone with a radio and a broken rifle for 6 hours. You've got a lioness fixing your light bulbs, Major." A heavy, suffocating shame settled over the room. The sergeant looked down at his boots, his face burning. He remembered the jokes in the mess hall. He remembered calling her Sparky and laughing when she didn't respond. He realized now that her silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of a veteran who had heard enough screaming to last a lifetime and had no interest in the petty chatter of men who played at war. But there was no time for apologies. The ground buckled again as a mortar landed on the perimeter wire. The high-pitched whine of the overcharged transmitter Elena had built began to scream. "Commander, the convoy is moving," Elena interrupted, her eyes snapping back to the flickering green screen. The personal drama was secondary to the biological clock of the battlefield. "I've guided them out of the bottleneck, but the jamming is pivoting. The enemy on the ridge, they know we've punched through. They're adjusting their fire toward the base." She began to type, her fingers a blur of motion. She wasn't just translating now. She was counter-hacking. She was finding the digital signature of the enemy's jamming equipment and feeding it back into their own headsets. "They're using a localized repeater," Elena muttered, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. "If I can lock the frequency, I can give you the exact coordinates of their mortar teams. But I need more power. I need you to kill the lights in the entire sector. Everything goes to the transmitter." "Do it," the commander ordered, before the major could even open his mouth. What would you do if you had to bet everything on a single burst of light? The room plunged into total, absolute darkness as the secondary generators were forced into the uplink. In the black, the only thing visible was the pale, ghostly glow of Elena's face and the sharp, rhythmic pulse of the signal needle. She was no longer a person. She was a conduit for the fog of war. She leaned into the mic, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm cadence. "Vanguard Alpha to all units. I have the target lock. Coordinates following. Ghost Lead, do you have eyes on the ridge?" "Copy, Vanguard." A voice crackled through the static, clear, sharp, and revitalized. "We see the muzzle flashes. Waiting on your mark." Elena closed her eyes. She wasn't looking at a screen anymore. She was visualizing the topography of the Dust Bowl canyons through the sound of the interference. She waited for the precise moment the enemy's signal peaked. "Mark," she whispered. Seconds later, the horizon through the tent's open flap erupted. It wasn't a single explosion, but a synchronized dance of fire as the convoy's heavy weapons, guided by the clerk in the dark, erased the enemy positions on the ridge. The sound was a distant, rolling thunder that signaled the breaking of the siege. As the echoes died down, the commander turned back to Elena. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blackened coin, a unit challenge coin from the highest level of special operations. He placed it on the workbench next to her screwdriver. "You saved them again, Whitaker," he said quietly. But the look on Elena's face wasn't one of triumph. It was one of haunting realization. She stared at the coin, her hand trembling for the first time. "Commander," she said, her voice barely a breath, "if they were using our repeater, if they knew our protocols that well—" She looked up, her eyes wide with a new, sharper terror. They weren't just listening to us. They were being fed. The blackout didn't start from the outside. Someone inside this outpost disabled the primary array before the first shot was even fired. The commander's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. The room, once filled with the relief of a battle won, suddenly turned into a cage of suspicion. Every man looked at the person next to him. The enemy wasn't just on the ridge. The enemy is in the room. And now, the person who knows too much is the only one who can't leave. The atmosphere inside the command tent at Outpost Vanguard had shifted from the frantic heat of battle to something far more frigid and lethal. The red emergency lights had flickered back to life, but they no longer felt like a sanctuary. In the silence that followed Elena's revelation, Every sound was magnified. The slow, rhythmic creak of the tent's support poles, the metallic rasp of a holster being unclipped, and the heavy, uneven breathing of men who realized the call was coming from inside the house. Think about the ultimate betrayal. It's one thing to face an enemy across a valley. It's another to realize you've been sharing a mess hall with the person who cut your throat while you slept. How do you look at your brother-in-arms when you know one of them is a ghost? The SEAL commander didn't move his eyes from Elena. He stood as a pillar of ash-covered granite, his hand resting with predatory stillness on the grip of his sidearm. He wasn't looking at the major, nor the sergeant. He was waiting for the Viper to finish the hunt she had started with a screwdriver and a radio. Elena's eyes remained fixed on the data stream, her fingers hovering over the keys. She could feel the gaze of the major, the man whose career was built on the order she had just dismantled, and the sergeant, whose face was now a mask of ashen terror. "The primary array wasn't blown by a mortar," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade against the neck. "The command overrides were entered manually at 21 o'clock hours. Someone used a level 4 maintenance key." The major's chest hitched. His hand, which had been reaching for a casualty report, froze. The smell of cold, sour sweat began to roll off him in waves. "Vance, you're overreaching. The equipment is old. It's the desert. Heat does things to the circuitry." "Heat doesn't type in a 12-digit encryption code, sir," Elena countered. She stood up slowly, the transition from Cable Girl to Viper now complete. She didn't need a rifle to be the most dangerous person in the room. Her weapon was the truth, and she held it with the steady hand of a woman who had already lost everything once before. She turned to the SEAL commander. "The coordinates I gave the convoy? I didn't just find them by tracking the enemy. I found them because they were being broadcast by a beacon inside this perimeter. Someone was marking our own gates for the final strike." What would you do in this silence? The air was so thin, it felt like it would shatter if anyone spoke too loudly. The sergeant, the man who had mocked her, suddenly stepped toward the major. It wasn't an act of aggression, but of realization. He saw the way the major's eyes were darting toward the exit, the way his fingers were twitching against his thigh. "Major," the sergeant rasped, his voice thick with a sudden, agonizing shame. "Tell me she's wrong." The major didn't answer. He didn't have to. The sound of a heavy bolt being pulled back on a weapon echoed from the darkness outside the tent. The SEALs team had moved into position. The betrayal was exposed, not with a grand speech, but through the quiet, technical diligence of the woman they had spent months trying to erase. In the aftermath, as the military police led the major away into the swirling dust of the desert night, a strange, heavy quiet returned to Outpost Vanguard. The battle was over. The convoy was safe. The traitor was caught. But the victory felt hollow, weighted down by the psychological cost of the fog of war. Think about the weight of a secret. Elena Vance had come to this outpost to disappear, to trade the lightning of a Tier 1 operator for the anonymity of a repair technician. But you can't bury who you are. Not when the world starts burning. The next morning, the sun rose over the Dust Bowl canyons, a harsh white light that stripped away the shadows of the previous night. Elena sat at her workbench, her dark hair tucked back, her hands once again busy with the guts of a broken radio. The Tier 1 coin the commander had left sat next to her tools, a small black circle of respect that no one dared touch. The sergeant walked into the tent. He didn't say a word. He didn't apologize. Some debts are too large for words to cover. He simply placed a steaming metal cup of coffee on the bench next to her father's screwdriver. He stood there for a second, his shadow falling over her work, and then he offered a single, stiff nod before walking back out into the glare. Elena picked up the cup. The heat seeped into her calloused palms, the bitter scent of the brew grounding her in the present. She wasn't looking for a medal. She wasn't looking for a promotion. She simply reached for her screwdriver and turned a single, tiny screw, tightening the world back together one thread at a time. She was still the cable girl to the rest of the base. She was still the quiet one in the corner. But as the distant hum of the repaired satellites returned to the air, everyone at Vanguard knew the truth. The quietest person in the room is often the only one holding the ceiling up. But as a